All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for registering and attending tonight's presentation, Getting Here From Where, Following Your Ancestors' Migration Trail. We're joined today by Jay Fonkert, the presenter for this evening. As I just alluded to, we will be recording this presentation and we will have it available on our YouTube channel. So once this ends, within the next day or so, we will get that uploaded to our YouTube channel and we will have that link sent out to everyone. My name is Matt Carter. I'm Executive Director for the Dakota County Historical Society. And we want to start right away by thanking our sponsor for this event. We received a Union Pacific Foundation COVID relief grant. With that grant, we've been able to promote and present more than 40 virtual presentations since March. And we've been kind of blown away by the response we've had. With those 40 presentations, we've had more than 850 people register for our events. We've actually reached at least 30 different states all across the country, represented by more than 180 cities. Here in Minnesota alone, we're at, the last count we checked, more than 90 cities were represented, with at least 14 of those right here from Dakota County as well. So we appreciate everyone that's joining us. So with that, at the bottom of your screen here, you should see there's an option for a chat box. Just because I enjoy seeing it, feel free to throw out where you're joining us from. Like I said, we have people here in this presentation tonight. We had about 60 people register, and they again are spread out throughout the country. So feel free to throw out where you're joining us from tonight. As you probably noticed, and when you joined, your microphone was muted. We do ask that everyone keep their microphone muted throughout the presentation to cut down on the feedback and background noise that we have during the program. Your camera was turned off when you joined. You are welcome to turn that back on if you'd like. And I see all the different areas popping up that people are joining us from. So I thank you for sharing all that information. Again, thank you for everyone that registered. If you're not familiar with who we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So again, thank you to those of you that did join, and the number of you that gave a donation to help offset the cost of the presentations, as well as those of you that actually took out membership. So we're grateful for that. Our organization was founded in 1939 by Fred Lasche, and we operate 3 historic sites within Dakota County. Our Lasche Museum, which is named for Fred Lasche, our founder, is located in South St. Paul, and that is our organizational headquarters, as well as where our artifacts and our research library is located. We also have our exhibits in there, so you're welcome to come in and do research when we're open. We are closed right now as part of the dial back for Minnesota here. We also operate the Leduc Estate in Hastings. That is an 1866 Gothic Revival mansion that looks at some of the early history of Minnesota as well as Civil War. And it all kind of revolves around the Leduc family that built the house and were mainstays in the community well into the 1900s. The third historic site we have is the Sibley site, and we operate that one in Mendota in partnership with the Minnesota Historical Society. And that site looks at Native American history, Minnesota's early settlers, and the fur trade. Our presenter tonight is Jay, as I mentioned, and Jay is a genealogy researcher, educator, and writer who focuses on 19th century Midwest research. He is a co-managing editor of Minnesota Genealogist and president of the Minnesota Genealogical Society. He has lectured at numerous regional and national conferences, lectured for genealogy societies in 11 different states, and has published more than 80 research and teaching articles. He joins us tonight for his second presentation since COVID, and so we're grateful for your willingness to join us and share your knowledge. And with that, I will turn it over to Jay, and he can share a little bit more about following your ancestors' migration trail.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. It's good to be with everyone tonight. Good evening. Although I shouldn't assume it's evening, because I know some of you may be in different time zones, but I think at least for many of you, the sun has probably gone down. You should be able to see my screen at this point, and hopefully you're hearing my voice. If you're having problems, send a message to Matt through the chat box, and we'll try to take care of it. If you have questions as we go along, you can also type those into the chat box. If it's something really urgent, you could interrupt and we could talk about it. But for the most part, we usually find it works best to hold the questions till the end and try to deal with them all then. I will also give you one other little warning here as we were warming up. We had a few little funky things going on with my PowerPoint controls. I think we've got them fixed so that the slides will advance properly, but if something sticks at some point, I may have to ask your forbearance to take a moment or two to try to get things straightened out. So with a little bit of luck, I'm going to try to advance the first slide. That will be our first test of whether the technology is working. And I hope you enjoy this evening's presentation. Well, there we go. It took a moment, but it did advance. That's good news. The question is, why here and from where? When we do family history research, we usually are working back in time. We usually know where somebody ended up or where they're at now, but we sometimes don't know where they came from. Now, we actually probably, in many cases, have a better chance of knowing where they came from before they arrived in North America than we do knowing what path or route they took to get where they ended up. We're going to focus primarily this evening on North American migration, specifically within the United States. We could go off on some sidetracks and talk a little bit about Canada, but there's just only so much we can cover in one sitting. Our itinerary tonight, and by the way, I just found this image of a I think it's a 19th century railroad ticket. Who would think that you could find a picture of a railroad ticket on Wikipedia? But there is actually a Wikipedia article about railroad tickets. So there you have it. This one's from Reno to Virginia City. I would have liked to have found a Midwest one, but this is the best we can do for the moment. So our itinerary tonight, we're going to talk a fair amount about history and geography, especially geography. I'll give you an overview of major migration routes from east to west. We're going to talk a little bit about cultural seed beds, different cultural regions in the eastern United States and how those spread westward across the continent. And then finally, toward the end, we'll talk about various sources and records that may help you reconstruct your family's migrations. If we have time, and I'm a little bit doubtful we will, but if we have time, I'll do a little short bonus case study. Where in the world was Niels? Let's see if we can move forward here. So we're going to learn about how opportunity and barriers affected migration. We're going to learn about common migration routes, and we're going to learn about clues to finding our ancestors' migrations. Now, I'm going to mention a number of books throughout the presentation. I think they're all listed in the syllabus or the handout that you'll receive. I can't guarantee that all of these are in print. In fact, I know many of them are no longer in print, but they're also not old enough to be found in Google Books. So this is why we have libraries. And of course, the picture I have here is of the William J. Hoffman Library and Research Center at the Minnesota Genealogy Center in Mendota Heights. I can't promise that all these books are in our library either, but you should be able to find them in a library someplace if you want to pursue them. So the keys to finding where are a combination of geography, history, and mining the clues that we can find in records. So let's start out with geography. I want to emphasize physical barriers to transportation. I want you to be able to visualize natural transportation routes over the landscape. And we're not going to really talk about it so much, but one of the things you may want to ask when you look at your own family history and where your ancestors or your family settled is, why did they go there? what opportunities were there? What was the suitability of the land for earning a livelihood? So you can sort of boil it all down to this one statement: study maps. I mean, really spend time sitting and looking at maps and just thinking about what you're seeing. I'm going to show you quite a few maps tonight. Many of them are going to be coming from the National Map Viewer, which is a service of the United States Geological Survey. It's entirely free. It's public domain. This is an overview shot of North America, but you can zoom in and out on this map and focus on specific regions with greater detail. It's just really a fun tool to play with. I guess you can do a lot of the same with Google Maps or Google Earth, but if I'm doing United States geography, I really like to use this site. It's got a search capability, and I'll also be showing you how to find historic topographic maps from earlier time periods as well. So let's start out with geography. And one of the things I want to emphasize is the importance of looking at geography from more than one scale. So here's a very localized shot of Montrose, Iowa. You can see the Mississippi River there. You can see the topography along the river. You can see that this is quite a small town, nestled between some hills along a creek bottom. But this doesn't really tell you a great deal. You need to take a little broader view. I'm wondering if any of you can guess what's on the other side of the river. Let's take a look. Nauvoo. I don't have any Mormon ancestry, but I am researching people who mixed in with the Mormons, who traded with the Mormons, who did business with them, and Nauvoo and Montrose were directly across the river from one another. Over here on the far left-hand side of the map, you'll see Sugar Creek. I think you can see my my mouse move up and down. That is actually the place where with the Mormon Exodus in 1846 or 47, if I recall correctly. This is where their first winter camp was after they had crossed the river. But now we want to take out and look at an even broader view. So here's Montrose in the center of the map on the Mississippi. And you start to get a whole different sense of where this place is and how it fit into the surrounding territory. I want to just take a moment here also to give you some tips on sort of how to know what you're seeing on a map. Now this is just from a standard highway atlas. There's nothing special about these maps. These two maps are from northern Iowa. Notice they look quite different. On the left-hand side, we have an area that was glaciated. It's quite level. Because it's quite level, the road systems and everything on this map are laid out in a grid format. We go 70 or 80 miles east, and we could be looking at the same thing in southern Minnesota as well. But notice it's different topography, it's a different landscape. Communities are laid out differently. The transportation routes tend to follow contours of the land. Here's a couple of other examples. The map on the left is from central Pennsylvania in the Appalachian Mountains, and you can see that except for the one highway that follows the Juniata River, everything else is following the mountain valleys. Everything's parallel to each other, trending southwest and northeast. We go to the right-hand side of the slide, and we see an entirely different landscape in coastal Georgia. It's flat, but this is not a public land state where we had townships and a public land survey. This is where we had meets and bounds measurements of property. in all kinds of crazy shapes and sizes, and the road system reflects that. So just looking at a map can sometimes give you some clues about the history of the areas that you're looking at. And then I want to take a quick look at really sort of a classic location in American migration history. Many of you probably have ancestors who came through Cumberland Gap. This again is an example of the close-up view you can get with the National Map Viewer. Now, Google Earth will give you a satellite image. That's cool. But here you're actually seeing the topographic map of Cumberland Gap. And of course, you can see that I think the old gap went actually through here, but you can see that the highway patterns are all based on that topography. Again, let's zoom out and get a broader regional view. So here's Cumberland Gap over here on the left-hand side of the map, and we see this same landscape that we saw in central Pennsylvania with the mountains all trending southwest and northeast, all running parallel to each other, and all of the migration routes follow the valleys. So this is the southern end of the Great Wagon Road leading to the Wilderness Road that went up to the Bluegrass Country in Kentucky. Now, if you're really interested in maps, I'd like to recommend that you take a look at Louise Cooke's website. She has at least 2 or 3 webinars. Some of them are free, some of them are fee-based, where she talks about how to use Google Earth, how to find old historical maps at the David Rumsey map site. I do a whole nother talk on finding maps. We're not going to really go into that tonight, but Lisa's programs are excellent. So that's a first look at geography. We're also going to want to know about the history of the places that our ancestors lived. And I'm not going to spend any amount of time on the history tonight, except to just list some kinds of things that you may want to think about as you think about your family's history. What was the role of wars or political history? Were there movements dictated by war? Did they get bounty lands from serving in the Revolutionary War? Did they go to military land districts? You'll want to know something about the opening of the public lands. When did the lands open in the areas that your ancestors settled? Homestead laws. We tend to use the term homestead very loosely and generically. Technically speaking, nobody homesteaded before 1862 because that's when the Homestead Act was passed. But Minnesota and the Dakotas and Nebraska were very heavy homestead states. A lot of people that settled in those areas in the 1860s and 70s and even into the 1880s did so with homestead land. That's not so true of Iowa because much of Iowa was already settled by the time the Homestead Act was passed. So for Minnesota and the Dakotas West, the Homestead Act is very important. You'll want to know something about the history of transportation technology. That steamboat transportation came into play, roughly around 1820. There was some earlier. That the railroad didn't get to Chicago until the early 1850s, didn't cross the Mississippi River until just before the Civil War, and then of course expanded very rapidly after the Civil War. You might even want to understand something about things like the history of barbed wire, which made it possible to separate cropland from land grazed by animals, or the role of drain tile, opening up wet areas like the Red River Valley for agriculture, or even refrigeration, which made it possible to ship meat from the high plains east to Chicago and on to the East Coast. One of the books I'm going to mention that does a wonderful job of talking about some of these things is a book about Chicago, and I'm sorry the name is escaping me right at the moment, but it's going to come up on screen fairly quickly. So we'll get it when we get there. So family history is a lot about time and space. It's a lot about history and geography. And so you may want to explore. There's some really wonderful books about what we call historical geography. These are historians and geographers who are concerned with how the landscape changed, how the use of the land changed, how the regions we know today developed. And so I'm going to show you very quickly a few books that I think are wonderful for family history researchers. They're not genealogy books, but they will really help you understand migration. On the left, Across This Land by John C. Hudson. He is a former professor at the University of Minnesota. On the right, one book from a series of 4 volumes by Donald Meinig. This one in particular is very useful for a lot of us with Midwest ancestry because it talks about migrations west between 1850 and about 1915. Here's the book I was trying to think of just a moment ago, Nature's Metropolis, Chicago and the Great West. This is an absolutely wonderful book. It's not just about Chicago. It's about the relationship between Chicago and its hinterland. That is, its relationship between the forest industries of northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, the agricultural industry of southern Minnesota and Iowa. If you're interested in the Midwest, this is just a wonderful book. And then on the right, this is a classic. It for sure is not in print, but you should be able to find it in libraries, by Ralph Brown, another former University of Minnesota geography professor, called The Historical Geography of the United States. It's a classic. We've already had a peek at modern maps from the United States Geological Survey and the National Map Viewer. I also want to give you a quick peek at a service they have for finding historical maps. Now, they haven't digitized all of their historical maps. You may still want to go to a map library like the Borchardt Map Library at the University of Minnesota. But you can find this historical topographic map collection by just Googling USGS historic topographical maps. That's easier than giving you the entire URL. You will be able to go to this page for what they call Topo View. So we had the National Map Viewer, now we have Topo View. This is where you can access digitized historical maps. You'll see a page like this that you can zoom in on, or you can go up here and search by a place name. It then will take you, so I searched for Cumberland Gap, and it lists a whole series of maps of Cumberland Gap. There's an 1888 edition. There's an 1891 that was updated and revised several times through the years. But I wanted to look at the oldest map I could find of Cumberland Gap. And once I get there, I can zoom in and I can zoom out. So this is the actual topographic map sheet from 1880 at TopoView. That's a little hard to read. So this is what you can see if you zoom in. Look at that. See the gap? It's not very wide. It was only wide enough to get one wagon through, and not even that at the beginning. But this was the path of least resistance coming out of the Great Valley of Virginia, getting through the Appalachians, and then in some north flowing streams that took them toward the bluegrass. How are we doing, Matt? Any important questions at this point, or should we move on?
So I don't see any real major questions. So I think we're good to keep moving.
Okay, we'll do that. So now we're gonna here in a few minutes actually talk about major migration routes. The thing I want to emphasize right at the outset is that our family histories are stories of families gathering, coming together, different branches of a family coming together, and then families dispersing and scattering. So I'll try to illustrate what I mean here. Um, Another book that I highly recommend if you're interested in history, if you're interested in family history, is a book called A Scattered People by Gerald McFarland. And I took this little quote because I think it says a lot about family history. Before these separate branches could be joined together, he's talking about a bunch of different branches of his family that started out in different places from New England down much farther along the East Coast that had to come together and meet in order to be connected. And then he follows those people westward across. So before these separate branches could be joined together in a single family tree, some or all of the families would need to move so that members from each of the lines could meet. I just think that that's just a very important observation. So I'm going to give you a quick look at one of my own personal examples. The Faulkner family lived in Virginia from about 1625, 26 to the into the early 19th century, the early 1800s. In the generation that I'm researching, children that were growing up between 1800 and 1830. This is one generation of this family. One son went northwest to Ohio, where he got military bounty land. Another daughter and son went west through Cumberland Gap to the bluegrass of Kentucky. And from this same family, another sibling went all the way southwest to Natchez, Warren County, Mississippi. So three very different migration routes just in this one family. And then what happens in the next generation? This son goes from the bluegrass to central Indiana, to Montrose, Iowa, down to Boone County, Missouri, and back to Douglas County, Illinois. I just think it's fascinating to track families across the country like this. And I like to compare this to rivers that are flowing across the floodplain. Families mix and get entangled over time, and then they disperse, much like the delta of a stream. This happens to be the delta of the Rhine River in the Netherlands. So we're going to talk about migration paths. And if I was to sketch a really simple map of American migration, this would be pretty close. These arrows roughly illustrate some of the major migration routes that people took moving west. But it's not quite that simple, of course, because every migration story is unique. Every family is unique. So yes, there was a major migration route up the Hudson through the Mohawk Valley along the Erie Canal down into Ohio. There was a major migration, especially from Maryland and southeastern Pennsylvania and Virginia down to Cumberland Gap. Some people went on to the southwest, some went up into Kentucky. There was migration up the Mississippi River, but of course, any individual family might have broken off these paths at any point and gone anywhere. I'll show you some maps in a few minutes of road systems before and after the Civil War, and you'll start to understand why that is so true. So let's just back up, take a bird's eye view of North America, And most of us, I know some of you may be in other parts of the country, but most of us are dealing with families that at some point got to the middle part of the continent. I think we all know from probably from grade school that there was a major barrier. It separated American interests from British and Indian allies to the west, the French up here. Until after the Revolutionary War, there was not much point in trying to cross the Appalachians, but even when that time came, we had to find routes through the mountains. So there's all kinds of barriers to migration. There was the fall line on the rivers coming in from the coast. There were the Appalachians. There were conflicts with the French, Native Americans, and the Spanish. There were large areas in the southeast. There were large swamps that southeastern Georgia, northeast Florida, that stopped migration in those directions. The Civil War had major impacts on migration. It basically closed migration up the Mississippi River below St. Louis. And then, of course, as people went west, they encountered arid lands. So there's just all these things going on that have a big effect on where people went. In general, we have two major migration streams. One is west by south, paralleling the Appalachians. But once people got across the mountains, for our part of the country, it was a west by north migration. It wasn't straight west. People moved northwest, and that in part reflects climate and rainfall. So we've got all these barriers. We've got the mountains in the east. We got another set of barriers in the west. And so I want to just take you through a series of maps to try to look a little more closely at these barriers. In this northern view, we have the Adirondacks up here in New York. We have the Catskills here, and of course we have the Appalachians here. So you can sort of see what the possibilities were. You either had to get around the mountains down here. There was some pathways through here. We'll look at those more closely. You could go up the Hudson and work your way across the Mohawk, up the Mohawk River Valley. And there was actually a road here before the Erie Canal, a tollway. The Erie Canal, for at least 20 or 30 years, sort of put it out of business. So that's the northern view. Let's move a little farther south. We actually have two mountain barriers here. We have the Blue Ridge and we have the Allegheny Front. And so you can either move through the Piedmont here, or you can get into the Great Valley here between the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny Front and come down this way. And eventually you could get to way down here, far northeast corner of Tennessee, actually, and the border with North Carolina for Cumberland Gap. We can go a little farther south. The Appalachians go all the way down to northeast Alabama. So we had Cumberland Gap up here, but after that, you either had to get through the gap and follow these rivers over here, or you had to follow streams on this side. And this is how, excuse me, this is how the cotton plantation owners worked their way into the Mississippi Delta region here in Arkansas and Mississippi. And then, of course, the other point of entry is New Orleans. Take a little closer look at the Cumberland Gap area, because this is something a lot of people aren't aware of. If you got yourself down from Virginia to Cumberland Gap, you really had two choices. You could go up into the bluegrass into Kentucky, Or there was this really complex river system. The Holston River, the Clinch River, the Powell River, all flowing to the southwest. So there was also a very significant migration that continued down this way into Tennessee and on into Alabama and Mississippi. Now, the Ohio River is also very important. The early settlers in Kentucky had to find a market for their corn and for their hogs, and that was oftentimes down the Mississippi to New Orleans. But once you got down here, it was a long trip back upriver, very arduous. So we have the development of the Natchez Trace from Natchez up toward Knoxville, and another road continuing to Lexington, and from Lexington up across the Ohio River into Ohio to Zanesville. So this is Zane's Trace. This is the Natchez Trace. So again, quick overview, just to add a few other features here. We have the mountains, we have the Dismal Swamp, swamp area in northeastern Ohio or northwestern Ohio. We run into aridity here. Settlement really started to slow down once people got into the middle of the Dakotas and Nebraska, and then of course the Rocky Mountains. And actually this is another thing that a lot of people don't know about. This was a very wet, very swampy region in Northwest Ohio. It was tough to get to Detroit. It was tough to get into Northern Indiana. And again, until this area was drained, migration had to bypass it to the south. There's a lot of similar examples, the Everglades, the Grand Prairie in eastern Illinois, the Red River Valley in Minnesota. So it's just helpful to know a lot about some of these things. So let's now actually talk about routes and corridors that people took. One set of atlases that I'd like to recommend, I just checked yesterday, they are still available at Heritage Books. They're soft cover, they're sort of oversized. They're not high quality maps, they're hand drawn, but they're a good starting point. These are all by Carrie Eldridge. There's one dealing with settlement between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, Missouri valleys. There's one dealing with trails going west out of New England, Appalachian trails to the Ohio River, and trails west of the Mississippi River. This is one of those atlases here. Over on the right is the book that I probably more highly recommend. This also is a paperback, a little better quality maps, and also I think better narrative, better description of migration routes. Map Guide to American Migration Routes by William Dollarhide. So let's take a quick look, and I'm going to be using maps from Dollarhide's book. Starting out, we're going to sort of try to move forward chronologically, starting out in the colonial area. We had a number of roads that basically went south in the coastal plain and through the Piedmont. Way over here is the Great Valley Road that we've talked about, running between the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies, down toward Cumberland Gap. These were unimproved roads. People could make 20 to 30 miles a day. It could take up to 2 months to go from Boston down to South Carolina and Georgia. So again, there's not much movement west. Almost all the commerce, almost all the migration is going from northeast to southwest. So you will find New England families that drifted south. You won't find as many southern families that went north, but you may have families that followed one of these routes. Moving forward in time, in the 20 years before the Revolution. Now, these were military roads. Originally, that was their purpose. We had to get across the mountains to do battle with the French at Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh. So these are military roads, but eventually they became paths for migration west. Forbes Road in southern Pennsylvania and Braddock's Road in western Maryland. Some of the slides I'm going to show you are based on what's called a rice map. This is a cartographer who drew these hand-drawn maps showing topography. They're really a lot of fun. And you can sort of see the challenges here with the mountains. You can see that to get out of New England, you had to first get over to the Mohawk Valley. That in itself was not easy. Once you got here, you could go north, go up the Mohawk River to Rochester, to Buffalo, and then follow. There's a fairly level plain along Lake Erie that you could follow southwest into Ohio. Here's another view of the Great Wagon Road and Cumberland Gap and the Bluegrass on one of these rice maps. Here's these rivers we talked about going down into Tennessee. This is the Ohio River. This is the New River. It's called the New River. Upstream here, it's the Kanawha River from Charleston down to the Ohio. The first route into Kentucky was the wagon road. There was also early passage down the Ohio from Pittsburgh. This was a difficult route, but by the early 1800s, this became a shortcut to get west out of Virginia. So here we have another view of the same thing. Again, this is essential. This is from the Dollarhide book. This basically shows the same routes we were looking at, the wagon road. Believe it or not, there's even an interesting group of Dutch colonists that lived in southeastern Pennsylvania and northern New Jersey who took this route. No, I'm sorry, they went west to Pittsburgh. They came down the river and colonized land in this part of Kentucky here. So Kentucky was settled mostly between 1780 and 1810 or so. It started to fill up. So where did you go once you got to Kentucky? There were basically three possibilities: northwest into Indiana and Illinois, into the Sangamon country around Springfield, Illinois. This is where people who did not have slaves went. So this is sort of the beginning of the split between the northern anti-slave interests and the southern slave interests before the Civil War. A lot of small slaveholders went into northeastern Missouri in an area that still is sometimes called Little Dixie. And then the larger slaveholders tended to go southwest down through Nashville toward Natchez into this floodplain of the Mississippi, which is actually, geographically speaking, this is actually the beginning of the Mississippi Delta. There was also migration into what was known as the Old Southwest in the early 1800s. The route we talked about from Knoxville and Nashville down to Natchez, but also, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of this road right now, but this was a federally funded road that went down to the southwest. Georgia was the last settled area of the original colonies. It was the most lightly settled. Topography and wetlands and things had a lot to do with that, but eventually this became a major migration route. We can't forget the Erie Canal. 1825. This really accelerated westward movement through New York. Again, remember, if your ancestors were in New England, how did they come west? By far the most likely route is the Mohawk River and the Erie Canal down into northeastern Ohio. And I'm going to show you some more about that Yankee migration in just a moment. So here's sort of the big picture view. The Adirondacks, the Catskills, the Mohawk River Valley, and then the sometimes called the Lakeshore Trail from Buffalo down into northwestern Pennsylvania into northeast Ohio. Now, just a little genealogy. One of the people I've researched is Conrad Romke. So I find him here in the 1860 census in Defiance, Ohio, of all places, and he's a boat builder. And of course, I thought, what in the world is a boat builder doing in northwestern Ohio? And of course, the answer is there were a lot of canals built. I'm not sure all of these were actually finished, but the canal era was from 1825 with the Erie Canal through about 1860. Why does it end after that? Railroads, plain and simple. You could work your way west by zigzagging north and south on these rivers, but once the railroads built bridges across the rivers, there was no need to travel on the water anymore. You could make your way almost directly east to west. Well, let's pass over this quickly. We've looked at this before, but again, there were a lot of military districts in Ohio where Revolutionary War veterans could enter bounty lands. Here is Zane's Trace. And so, and of course, the original public land survey was here in eastern Ohio. The first land offices for selling off public land were in Ohio. A lot of our Midwest ancestors passed through Ohio. And then, of course, starting in 1811, the National Road was built. Now it took, what, 28 years to get from western Maryland to Vandalia. This part here is the part that was built with federal funding. These other parts were private toll roads, but this was a macadamized road. That is, it was a hard surface road. It was a combination with gravel and oil. They weren't very good at drainage, so that the road deteriorated rapidly because of drainage problems, but you could drive a coach across this road. So here's the National Road right here. And you can see its relationship to the river system, to the mountains, and to Zane's Trace and Natchez Trace. So before the Civil War, settlements pretty much limited to Chicago and east. You can see there was quite a system of roads, of major roads and lesser roads. The point being that I think people zigzagged around a lot more than we realize sometimes. It was not just a case of everybody following the Erie Canal or everybody following the Wilderness Road or everybody following the National Road. There were a lot of opportunities for getting off the main track, as you can see here in Indiana and Illinois. Here is a more detailed map of road routes that existed in 1860. This is from the Historical Atlas of the United States from the National Geographical Society. So there was a lot of routes, and I think it's frustrating for us sometimes. Even when we can figure out where our ancestors lived, we oftentimes think, well, gee, I'd like to know what route they took. And the fact of the matter is, we usually don't know with any certainty, but we can start to understand the major patterns, and we can at least imagine how our ancestors fit into those patterns. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about folkway migrations and cultural seedbeds. This is a book by David Hackett Fisher, and this is a really it's very academic. It's not light reading, but it helps you understand the different cultural seedbeds that developed in the eastern United States, coming from different parts of the British Isles. So people in New England came largely from East Anglia, north of London. People in the Chesapeake Bay area came largely from the southern part of England. The Quakers came from the northern Midlands. And then the backcountry folks in Appalachia came a lot from what's known as the borderlands between England and Scotland. A much more approachable book, more journalistic, that is not hard to read. It's very enjoyable. It has some political overtones, but this is a book by Colin Woodard called American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. You can see them listed. I'm going to just take a few moments to focus in on what he called Yankeedom, the Midlands, which is a lot of English and German, the Deep South, and Greater Appalachia, where Scots-Irish went. This is actually an enlargement of the cover of the book. I've added the arrows so that you can see these sort of major migration paths. This is the Yankee migration that goes a lot into the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota. This is where a lot of the Scots-Irish went out of Appalachia down toward Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, and northern Texas. So this is just a fascinating, fascinating book. Now, this is my own map based on Woodard. So we have the Yankees up here through northern Ohio, northern Indiana, into the Midwest. You have the Midlands, a lot of Germans, but also English, coming out of the Philadelphia, Baltimore area. They tend to follow a very narrow path across the Midwest. This is basically the national road they're following. You've got the Greater Appalachian seedbed that moves southwest, and some of it breaks off and goes into Illinois and Missouri, and then the Deep South migration. And this is from, we mentioned John Hudson earlier, the historical geography book. This is from an article by him where he used census data to actually plot where the Yankee settlement went. And so this area outlined in orange, these are county boundaries he's following. These are in fact the counties that had the highest percentages of people coming out of New England at the time of the 1880 census. So sort of in summary, we have the Yankees. And these are different cultures, very different attitudes about slavery, very different attitudes about communities. The Yankees in the Midlands had newspapers. People coming out of Greater Appalachia and the Deep South did not. There's just a lot of cultural differences that you still see in American culture today. So you've got the Yankees, you've got the Midlands following a very narrow path into the Midwest and then spreading out a bit once they get to Iowa and Nebraska. They have the Greater Appalachian seedbed following the Great Wagon Road into the Ohio Valley and the Ozark Plateau in North Texas. And you have that Deep South slaveholding plantation agriculture seedbed that moves down the old Federal Road into what was called the Old Southwest and on into the Delta and East Texas. So this again is just a simplified version of Woodard's map showing you where these population seedbeds went. And it's also has something to do with climate and soil. It's not just culture. These New Englanders were crop growers. wheat was the common frontier crop. Corn came later. And these are areas that were suitable to wheat culture. The Appalachian culture was much more of a feed corn livestock culture. They kept hogs, they grew corn, they fed them to the hogs. They shipped the hogs to Cincinnati to market. They turned the corn into bourbon. That was their cash crop, was corn turned into hogs and bourbon. And then, of course, this was a cotton culture in the South. So we know where they ended up. Where the heck did they come from? I just want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the basic records that you can use. Perhaps, probably to nobody's surprise, censuses and city directories are probably the most useful, but there are many records, and I'll show you some samples that have birthplace information, and you're not necessarily looking for the birthplace of the parents, you're looking for the birthplaces of the children, because that's what tells you what the migration path was. And we also really like to use records that stay open over time. So things like pension application files that might have been open for 10, 15, or 20 years. Probate files where an estate was in probate for several years. These often have clues to people's movements during those time periods. Trying to get my cursor in the right place here to click. So let me propose a genealogist lucky 13. We're not going to talk about all these in any detail. Census records, death certificates, passenger records, naturalization records, passports, church records, directories, land records, tax records, probate records, bounty land files, Civil War pension files, and guardianship files. These ones on the left are probably the ones that beginning genealogists are most likely to use. These over here are ones that you're more likely to use as you become more experienced, but all of them can have good clues to migration. I'm going to spend the most time on the census. This is the 1880 census of the James Faulkner family in Illinois. Notice here it gives us, it's the first census that gave us the birthplace of the individual, the individual's father, and the individual's mother. So we want to pay attention especially to the children. So here we can see children here. The oldest children are born in Missouri. The younger children are born in Illinois. This tells us the family must have actually moved east from Missouri back to Illinois. So where are we going to look in 1870? We're going to look in Illinois or in Missouri. What shall we look for? I'm going to suggest that, first of all, this name gets spelled 8 or 9 different ways. So the surname is problematic. But I like to search for unusual given names. So I'm going to search for Cyrus, a name starting with F with a K in the middle and ending in R, someplace in Missouri. I don't know where in Missouri. But let's see if I get lucky. By golly, there is only one. The Ancestry.com index only has one individual that fits that search. Cyrus Fokker of Boone County, Missouri. And here they are, 1870. He's 1 year old. Now what are we going to do? Take a look at this census. We have James and Julia and Robert, Julia, daughter, Cyrus. Oh, who's this? Ann B. Sears, she's 62 years old. Mildred, she's 20. Maybe Mildred's a daughter of Sears, of Ann. Maybe Ann is a mother of either James or Julia, possibly. Ann was born in Virginia, but we're not going to find her probably in early censuses in Virginia, but Mildred was born in Indiana, about 1850. So I'm going to suggest that that's where we would look next. We'd look at Indiana, and we might look for Mildred. Census searching it requires some creativity. going to search on name variants, use first names, search for the children, search for neighbors or people in the household that you think might be relatives. Let's see here. I'm going to very quickly just go through a few more things. Death certificates. This is for Elizabeth Ann Ellenbach. It says she's born, that's an interesting state, Missouri. I think maybe that's what it should be called today, is Missouri. Doesn't tell us where though in Missouri. And you've all seen, I'm sure, death certificates where the informant, the person who gave the information, didn't know where a parent was born. In this case, I have a funeral booklet from her funeral, and the funeral booklet gives me a specific place name. This is the family we just saw in the 1870 census in Boone County, Missouri. Passenger arrival records. I've got some information about this in the handout. After about 1906, it asks some very interesting questions. Names of the nearest relative at home and where the person was going. So let's take a look here. Name and complete address of the nearest relative or friend. This is very helpful. Now, in this case, we're jumping all the way across the pond to Norway, but it says his nearest relative at home is Andreas Sve in Leksvikstrand in Norway. What a wonderful clue for tracking that family back. Whether going to join a relative or friend, where are you going when you get off the boat? He was going to join Uncle Andreas in Minot, North Dakota. Guess what? I have never found any record suggesting that he ever got to North Dakota. I don't think he ever got past Minnesota. Declaration of Intention for Citizenship. I think we can blow this up. This is from 1934. Here we go. It gives us the birthplaces of all the children. So we know that this family has lived in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. It's lived in Mayville, North Dakota, and it's lived in Albert Lea, Minnesota, just from this one record. Passport applications may give similar kinds of information. This woman's children were born at Nantucket and at New Haven, and that she, Mrs. Nelson, was born at Rochester, New York. So we have a little short migration history right there. Church records can be helpful. Walter Fonkert, my great-grandfather's brother. This is in Dutch, of course, but this is a church record from Pella, Iowa. It tells us that he came to that congregation from Harrison, Dakota. The membership records tell us that he left. He came from Harrison and he left to go to Orange City in 1888. So again, a short migration history. Deeds, sometimes, some people bought land in a county before they moved there. So in this case, in Sioux County, Iowa, A.P. Zorgdrager of Hardin County, that tells us where he was before. Tax lists, this is in Mercer County, Kentucky. John Faulkner had 98 acres, but look at this. He also had 100 acres in Gallatin County. So I know I need to look for him prior to 1818 in Gallatin County. City directories will sometimes tell you when people moved. So Marie Kohlberg moved to Gordon, Wisconsin between 1912 and 1913. Guardianship records may give you information. This is a guardianship record for Cyrus Faulkner. It's the same Cyrus we looked at earlier. He's being admitted to the deaf and dumb school in Jacksonville, Illinois, but it tells us where he came from. A will may identify locations of where people went. So Charles Gerloff's will identifies his niece in Canyon City, Colorado, his niece Emma in Idalia, Colorado, and his niece's children in Guthrie, Oklahoma. A probate case, receipts of heirs receiving their property may tell you where those heirs, may tell you where they lived. Chancery Court records telling us that these people, this is in Virginia, that these people are not inhabitants of Virginia. In this case, it tells us that Joshua Blanton and his wife Elizabeth actually live in Garrard County, Kentucky. So there's just all kinds of records, bounty ward records. In this case, it tells us that he lived in Kentucky until 1851. He was in Missouri till 1865. And then he lived after that in Leavenworth, Kansas. So these are wonderful records, a pension record giving similar kinds of information, a migration history. So I'm going to, we're running out of time. I'm going to pass through this little case study. I'd love to share it with you another time. But I just want to, let me see here. I want to get back one slide. There we go. I just gave you a full hour on this one topic. I do another talk that's sort of a companion piece, which is Why Were They There? Where I talk about the kinds of evidence you can find to try to explain why people went where they went. Tonight, we've tried to talk about where they came from and what paths they might have taken. So this is another talk that hopefully I'll be able to give at some point around the Twin Cities in the next year someplace, and I would love to have you there for that as well. I think it's time to take questions. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Lest I forget, before I take questions, let me say that I know this is a very busy time. It has not been a wonderful year for us, but I hope that you all have a merry everything and a happy all the time. So Matt, I'd be happy to try to tackle any questions that came in.
All right. Thank you, Jay. That was some excellent information. And like you said, there's a lot to cover in just a little bit amount of time. Some of the questions that came in, if these maps are from the 1800s, so you were showing earlier in the presentation some maps, do they indicate tribal lands on them?
I'm sure there are maps that do. I would suggest going to the Library of Congress, to their American Memories website. You should be able to find it from the Library of Congress website. They have a large map collection online, and a lot of historical maps. I would be surprised if you didn't find maps of that sort there. I actually had one slide I took out today to try to save on time. It's not a map of tribal lands, but it's a map that shows, I believe it was from the National Geographic Historical Atlas, I think is where I got it from. But it shows the general locations of Native American populations prior to 1800.
Okay. Next question. The poster said, I know we have most information about the migration from Europe. Is there any data about the migration from Mexico, or how would one start to collect information about ancestry from there?
Boy, again, I'm going to give partly the same answer. Library of Congress map collection, historical geography atlas from the National Geographic Society. But I want to also put out a special shout out to Family Search. If you're a genealogist, I hope you have used Family Search, www.familysearch.org, service of the Mormons, associated with the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. Go to their wiki. They have a research wiki. You can search by topic. They have done a tremendous amount of work on Mexican and Central American migration to the United States. A lot of Mexican church records and other kinds of records. I haven't read those articles because that's not an area that I research, but I would almost guarantee you will find some very helpful articles on researching Mexican and other Hispanic population groups.
Excellent. One of the other questions was, how about info on routes from to Minnesota from New England mill owners and their more recently immigrated workers?
Well, I'm not sure about the workers. I guess that would depend on the time period. But, if one of the maps we had up, I think toward the beginning, I sort of showed just an overview northern tier map from New England to the Midwest. If you can sort of visualize that in your mind, once you got across New York, central New York, to the area of Rochester and Buffalo, you had a problem. There were these big lakes in the way. You had to dip south. If you have families that came from New England and they ended up in southern Wisconsin or northeast Iowa or Minnesota or North Dakota, they probably never went south of present day Interstate 70, which goes through Columbus and Indianapolis. They probably actually stayed a good 60, 70, 80 miles north of that and came across far northern Ohio. Depending on the time period, they might have come through the Great Lakes. They might have gotten to Michigan and gone across Michigan and taken a boat across Lake Michigan. But especially after 1860, they went through Chicago almost without any doubt whatsoever. Now, of course, there's no records of Great Lakes passengers. There's no records of train passengers. So, unless they paused someplace along the way long enough to show up in a local record, you're probably not going to be able to figure out exactly what path they took. But if you were a wheat and dairy farmer out in New England, you had no reason to go south of Indianapolis. You probably came across northern Indiana, northern Illinois, and either came up the river, or if it was a railroad area, came on the train, or whatever, up into our area. Now, mill workers, you got mill workers, you got mine workers in northern Minnesota. A lot of these sort of natural resource based industries that actually advertised and recruited for workers in Europe, especially from, say, the mid 1880s to the early 1900s. A lot of those people were recruited directly to where they ended up in Wisconsin or Minnesota.
All right, we'll try and get through a few more here really quick. Do you have a complete list of the books you mentioned? Someone mentioned that the handout looks like it stops at the last names for the authors at M.
Let me see, who might I have missed? I'm trying to think if I mentioned any in the PowerPoint slides that weren't in the handout. I can't recall.
Yeah, and I'll also add too that with the recording of it, if you think you may have missed a book that isn't in the handout, it might be easiest if you just go back to the recording once it's posted,
or shoot me an email.
Okay.
The books I mentioned, I think, are my favorite ones. There are a number of others, but it's possible I accidentally cut something off the handout. I don't believe I did, but it's entirely possible.
All right, so looking for some more information. So one of the questions was, when they landed at Ellis Island via boat, how did they learn of these routes and make their way to it?
Well, first of all, I should point out that Ellis Island was only open from about 1891 or so to 1922 or 23. So, but regardless, when people landed at New York, and I want to talk particularly about the period after the Civil War, they may very well have known where they were going. If you look at emigration records from Germany or Sweden or Norway, oftentimes the records from the port of emigration, whether it was Hamburg or Oslo or Gothenburg, actually said where they were going in North America. Actually, many times gave a town name. And that's usually an indication that they already knew somebody there. They already had family there. There are, of course, we know there were cases where people landed in New York and there were hucksters that met the boats and who were recruiting perhaps for mines in Minnesota, or recruiting for lumber companies in Wisconsin or something like that, or meat packers in Chicago or whatever, and said, come with me, we'll get your train ticket, you're on your way. So I don't know that there's a simple answer to the question. All these things are possible. Again, remember, really, it's a whole different story after the Civil War. The railroads are in place. There are railroads into Iowa by the 1860s. There's railroads to St. Paul by about that same time, roughly. It's a very different story before the Civil War, especially before 1850.
All right, and then we'll do this one as the last question. So someone said that their family landed in New York pre-Ellis Island, and they had heard that they may have come through the Great Lakes to Wisconsin. Does that sound like something that would have been possible as far as a travel route?
Yeah, it's possible. I again, unfortunately, that we don't have records to track that. There's also people that came through Canada who disembarked at Montreal, or trying to think of the other port that's escaping my mind right now. It's probably a fairly rare case where somebody followed the Great Lakes the entire way, down Lake Ontario and Erie, and then up north on Lake Huron and around Michigan and back down, Lake Michigan to Chicago, or up through the Sioux Locks up to Lake Superior. That's probably not very likely. If they've traveled on the Great Lakes, they probably got off the boat at Toledo or Detroit and went across Michigan, either by rail to Chicago, or maybe they took a boat across Lake Michigan. Probably very few people made it to the middle of the continent entirely on the Great Lakes. I'm sure there are some that did, but that would not have been the common thing.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jay. And with that, we will end the presentation for this evening. We want to thank everyone that joined us for this presentation, and we will be getting this video uploaded to YouTube within the next day or so. Usually by the next day, we've gotten pretty good at getting it up on YouTube, and we'll send out the link to everyone. We'll include the handout again for those of you that may not have received it. And we will also have a survey that just about 10 questions, should take no more than 5 minutes. Let us know what your thoughts were on the presentation, how well it went. If you have any other suggestions for future topics, we do use those to help try and cater towards what the public is wanting to get out of presentations. So with that, again, thank you, Jay, and we appreciate everyone that gave the donation or took out a membership. If you are interested in that, you can visit our website, dakotahistory.org. Otherwise, we hope everyone has happy and safe holidays.
Thank you all. I enjoyed it. Good night.